Hello everyone, Mr. Lipchick here, and our topic for today is going to be emergency management and how that fits into Homeland Security. A little history of emergency management. Early in our nation's history, there was little effort on the part of the federal government to deal with emergencies. In 1803, the Fire Disaster Relief Act was passed to help Portsmouth, New Hampshire recover from fires. In 1927, the Lower Mississippi Flood Control Act was passed as a means of responding to flooding along the Lower Mississippi. All of these, however, were reactive measures. They were not designed to prevent or mitigate disasters, and disaster relief was still pretty much at the local level. The federal government became more involved with emergency management during the 1930s, primarily as a relief act. In other words, as a way of putting people to work. To the right, you see a picture of the city of Pittsburgh downtown during the flood of 1936. The Flood Control Act of 1936 established the Army Corps of Engineers, which is partly military and partly civilian agency. President Roosevelt created the Office of Emergency Management, which also came to include dealing with war-related emergencies at home. Following World War II, federal emergency management evolved over a period of years through a number of succeeding agencies. And there was a great deal of duplication in the system and confusion regarding which responsibilities belonged to the state and which belonged to the federal government. And this could cause confusion of effort and waste of resources. So, in 1978, in response to criticisms of federal emergency management, President Carter created the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, to oversee all federal efforts. It consolidated a number of federal agencies, but could not include them all. President Clinton made it a cabinet-level position because of its importance. After the 9/11 terror attacks, FEMA was placed into the Department of Homeland Security and currently operates as part of it. The all hazards approach. The all hazards approach to emergency management identifies specific disaster agents that are at the cause of the event. The agents are defined by their specific characteristics, and these characteristics will help in planning the appropriate response to the event. Defining characteristics of disaster agents include the scope of the impact, that is, how big the impact is, the speed of the onset of the disaster, the duration of the impact, the health threat involved, property threats, secondary threats, and predictability. Disaster agents will vary widely in these characteristics. For instance, hurricanes versus tornadoes. Hurricanes are fairly predictable in that weather radar can usually track them off at sea. Tornadoes, on the other hand, form very rapidly, and while some early warnings exist, they are much harder to predict. Vulnerabilities. Hazard exposure is the degree to which geographical location exposes a community to a potential threat. Human vulnerability, the degree to which humans can be harmed by extremes of temperature, pressure, chemical, radiological, and infectious agent exposure. And humans will vary in the degree to which they are affected by these according to age, illnesses, and other factors. Agricultural vulnerabilities, the degree to which animals and plants are vulnerable to extremes of temperature, pressure, chemical, radiological, and infectious agents. Agricultural vulnerability will vary among animals as each species has widely varying physical characteristics. Structural vulnerability. This occurs when buildings and other physical structures are not designed to withstand extreme environmental conditions. And social vulnerability. And this is the capability of a person or group to anticipate, cope with, and resist and recover from a natural disaster. Response protocol. So how do we respond to these things? It largely depends on the type of disaster impacts. Physical impacts involve death, injury, and property damage. Societal impacts are long-term functioning of households, businesses, and other organizations. Psychological impacts involve impacts to individuals or group state of mind. And demographic impacts are changes in age, race, ethnic, or other makeup of the population. Along with economic impacts, the loss of property, economic assets, or economic capacity. As well as political impacts, as social conflicts sometimes emerge during the time of a disaster. There are 3 pre-impact emergency management interventions. One is hazard mitigation, pre-impact practices that passively protect against casualties and property damage. For instance, maybe building an irrigation ditch next to a body of water that floods. Emergency preparedness practices. These are pre-impact actions that provide the human and material resources needed to support active responses at the time of impact. And disaster recovery practices. And these are pre-impact recovery, preparedness, and post-impact recovery actions. Things that are done to prepare for this impact. Elements of disaster response. One is rescue, locating the injured and initiating emergency treatment and care. Relief is logistical items such as food, shelter, clothing, and counseling. And recovery, that is cleanup, rebuilding, and returning to normalcy. Agencies must coordinate their efforts to make this happen. Key agencies involved in emergency responses include law enforcement, fire departments, EMS, private facility security, public utilities, construction, engineering, and technical specialists, state and federal government agencies such as the National Guard, FBI, and FEMA, and convergent volunteer groups such as the Civil Air Patrol. Interagency coordination. Agencies must coordinate in terms of logistics, delegation and decision making, communications. Communications is key. You don't want the news getting different reports from different levels at different times. The public would be confused and misinformed. Planning, public information, administration, and finance. There is a financial component to all this. It has to be paid for. So to summarize, the history of emergency management in the U.S. is one of increasing involvement of the federal government. Different disaster agents will dictate different responses. Potential vulnerabilities and impacts must be measured and planned for. And planning must occur to facilitate interagency coordination in the response. That concludes our discussion. Thank you for attending, and I look forward to seeing you in the live lesson. Have a great day.